Claude responded. My son-in-law sent Emily a text that read, "Make sure your father isn't at the ceremony," and she forwarded it to me without a single word of her own. My son-in-law sent Emily a text that read, "Make sure your father isn't at the ceremony," and she forwarded it to me without a single word of her own. I read it standing in my garage, wrench still in my hand, and instead of calling her back in a panic, I set the phone down on my workbench and finished the brake job I was in the middle of. Then I walked inside, poured myself a glass of water, and made one phone call that would quietly unravel every dollar I had ever put behind my daughter's new life. By sunrise the next day, there would be 94 missed calls stacked up on my phone, all from two people who had decided just days earlier that they didn't need me in the room anymore. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 63 years old, and I've spent almost 40 years running an auto repair shop outside Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place with 3 bays and a gravel lot, and my name painted on a sign I built myself out of plywood back in 1989. I never inherited a dime. I never had a rich uncle or a family name that opened doors. What I had was a set of hands that knew engines, a habit of showing up on time, and a daughter named Claire, who came into my life the same year my wife Donna did not leave it soon enough. Donna passed when Claire was 9. Ovarian cancer, the kind that doesn't give you much warning and doesn't leave much time to argue with it. I remember sitting in a hospital hallway with a 9-year-old holding my hand, both of us not understanding yet how much our lives had just changed. And I remember deciding right there that whatever else happened to me, that little girl was never going to feel like she was raising herself. I didn't get everything right. I burned dinner more times than I can count, and I learned how to do a French braid from a woman at the church 2 pews over because I couldn't find a video that made sense to my hands. But I showed up. Every school play, every teacher conference, every skinned knee at 2 in the morning. It was me in the doorway, still smelling like motor oil most nights because there wasn't always time to shower before bedtime stories. I built Briggs Auto out of a 2-bay garage I rented with money I didn't really have, and over 30 some years it grew into something with 4 full-time mechanics, a waiting list for oil changes, and a reputation in 3 counties for not cheating people, especially not women who came in alone and got treated with respect instead of upsold on parts they didn't need. I never did that to build a business. I did it because I remembered what it was like to have nothing and to need somebody to be decent to you anyway. Every truck I bought, every new lift I installed, every employee I put on payroll, it was all in service of one idea I never said out loud to anybody. Claire was never going to lie awake worrying about money the way her mother and I once did in our first apartment with a space heater instead of real heat. By the time she turned 26, Claire had grown into a woman who made me proud in ways I didn't always have words for. She'd gotten her degree in occupational therapy, she had her own apartment, her own car I helped her pick out but never made her feel obligated over, and she called me every Sunday just to talk, the way we always had since she was small. I paid off her student loans as a graduation gift without telling her until the loan servicer sent her a letter saying the balance was zero. I helped with her wedding fund the day she got engaged. No hesitation, because that's simply what a father does when he's spent a lifetime building toward exactly this kind of moment. I never imagined that same devotion would eventually be used to paint me as the villain in my own daughter's story, just because I refused to disappear quietly once somebody else decided I'd outlived my usefulness. Claire met Bradley Ashcombe at a work conference in Cleveland about a year and a half ago, and I remember the night she brought him home to meet me, how she practically vibrated with excitement telling me he came from a family that owned a chain of dental practices around the Cincinnati area. Real money, generational money, the kind that gets passed down instead of built up from a gravel lot. Bradley shook my hand with a grip that felt like he was testing something. Good eye contact, all the right words about respecting a hard-working man. I liked him fine in the beginning. He was sharp, he had ambition, and Claire lit up around him in a way I hadn't seen since before her mother passed. I wanted to believe he was exactly what he seemed, because I wanted my daughter to have found someone who would take care of her the way she deserved. But there were small things early on I brushed past because I didn't want to be the father who couldn't let his little girl grow up. Comments about how his family didn't just work, they built empires, said with a laugh that never quite reached his eyes. He mentioned his father's dental practices and his mother's seat on some hospital foundation board more often than seemed natural around me, like he needed the room to understand exactly where I ranked. Claire either didn't notice or decided it wasn't worth noticing, because by then she was falling fast. And when you're falling that fast for somebody, you don't want anybody pointing at the cracks in the foundation before the concrete's even dry. I told myself I was being an overprotective old man, I told myself a man who claimed to respect hard work would eventually show it, given time. I wanted so badly to be wrong about the feeling sitting low in my gut, and for a good long while, I convinced myself I was. Bradley proposed to Claire at a vineyard outside of Yellow Springs, and when she called me that night crying happy tears down the phone line, I felt nothing but joy for her, the real kind, the kind that quiets every worry you've been quietly carrying. I told her right then I'd cover the wedding, every bit of it, because that's what a father does for his only daughter, and I meant it with my whole chest. It didn't stop at the wedding. A month later, Bradley sat across from me at my own kitchen table and laid out a plan to leave his sales job and open his own dental supply distribution company, something he swore would be worth millions inside 5 years. He needed $125,000 to get it off the ground. I want to be clear that I didn't hand that money over because I was dazzled by him. I've run a business for 4 decades. I know the difference between a real plan and a fantasy dressed up in a suit. Bradley's numbers looked solid enough, and I told myself I was investing in the man who was going to take care of my daughter when I was gone. On top of the wedding and the loan, I co-signed the mortgage on a house out in New Albany because Bradley's income on paper wasn't quite enough yet to qualify without somebody backing him. In the span of about 5 months, my name and my money were wound through nearly every major decision in their new life together. The venue, the caterer, the florist, the business loan, the mortgage. I didn't see it as control. I saw it as love, the same love that had me working Saturdays 20 years earlier, so Claire could have a real winter coat instead of a hand-me-down. I would learn soon enough that Bradley did not see it the same way at all. Once the wedding planning got moving, I started noticing things shift in a way that put a knot in my stomach. Bradley's mother, Linda, inserted herself into every decision. The guest list, the seating chart, the flowers, and every time I tried to weigh in on something I was paying for, the conversation quietly got redirected somewhere else. Claire started saying things like, "Bradley's family just does things a certain way, Dad," whenever I asked a simple question about the budget. I paid every deposit without complaint because I wasn't trying to control my daughter's wedding. I just wanted to be part of the day I was funding. At the rehearsal dinner tasting in April, Bradley made a joke in front of his parents about how his father-in-law probably thought a wine pairing was just picking the bottle that wasn't beer, and the table laughed. And Claire laughed along with them, and something in my chest went cold and still in a way I hadn't felt since the week we buried Donna. I let it go. I told myself weddings make everybody a little strange, that once the ceremony was behind us, things would settle back into something normal. But the little digs kept coming. Comments about my truck, about the grease under my fingernails, no matter how hard I scrubbed, about how I still smelled faintly like the shop, even fresh out of the shower. Claire stopped shutting it down the way she used to. She used to be the first one to snap at anybody who disrespected her old man. Now she just went quiet. Or worse, she smiled along like she didn't want to rock the boat with her new husband's family. I felt myself getting slowly erased out of my own daughter's life, replaced by people who had money, but had clearly never once learned what it costs to actually earn it. By early June, 3 weeks out from the wedding, I had paid out close to $70,000 for the venue, the catering, the florist, and the string quartet, and I still hadn't been given a single real role in the ceremony beyond signing checks. Bradley's father was giving the toast. Bradley's mother was walking Claire's bridal party through some tradition from her side of the family that nobody had explained to me. I asked Claire gently over the phone one night if I would still be the one walking her down the aisle, and there was a pause on the line long enough to answer the question before she even opened her mouth. "We're still working out the logistics, Dad," she said, and something about the word logistics coming out of my daughter's mouth, about her own father walking her down the aisle, nearly cracked something open in my chest, right there on the spot. I didn't push it. I told myself I was being sensitive, that stress does strange things to people during wedding season, that Claire still loved me the same way underneath it all, even distracted as she was by a man and a family who clearly wanted less of me around and more of my money moving through their accounts. I kept paying every invoice. I kept transferring money into the shared wedding account Claire and I had set up together for exactly this purpose. I kept making sure Bradley's new business account had enough cushion from that startup loan to survive its first shaky year. I was holding up their whole world financially while quietly being pushed out of it emotionally, and I didn't understand how far that push would go until one message landed on my phone at 6 in the morning. 4 days before the wedding, I had already paid for in full. It was a Wednesday, 4 days out, and I was up early like always, standing in my garage going over the books before the shop opened, when my phone lit up on the workbench. I figured it was a supplier or one of my guys running late. Instead, it was a message Claire had forwarded from Bradley, meant for someone else in his family, apparently sent to the wrong thread. It read, "Make sure her old man isn't at the ceremony. I don't want him standing there in a rental suit looking out of place next to my family. She'll get over it." Claire had forwarded it with nothing attached, no explanation, no apology, just the screenshot sitting there in our text thread, like she couldn't even find the words. I stood in that garage and read it 3 times. Slow. The way you read something, hoping it'll rearrange itself into a sentence that hurts less. My own daughter, the little girl I raised alone for 17 years after her mother died, the woman whose wedding I had paid nearly $70,000 for, whose fiancé's business I had funded out of my own retirement savings, whose mortgage carried my name and my credit, had sent me proof that the man she was marrying didn't think I belonged in the room, and she hadn't said one single word in my defense. I felt something in my chest close, not slam shut, just close, quiet and final, the way a door closes when somebody's finally done arguing with themselves about whether to shut it. I didn't call her screaming. I didn't fire back a paragraph demanding an explanation. I set the phone down on the workbench, and I finished torquing the lug nuts on the sedan in front of me, because I've learned in 40 years of business that anger makes a man sloppy, and I have never once made a sloppy decision with real money on the line. I walked inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat at my kitchen table thinking it through with a clear head. The same way I'd think through a contract dispute or a decision that could sink my whole shop if I got it wrong. Here's what I knew for certain, sitting there that morning. The wedding venue deposit, the remaining balance to the caterer and the florist and the quartet, all of it was sitting in a joint account Claire and I had opened together. An account where I was listed as the primary holder because Claire hadn't built up enough of her own credit history yet to open it alone. The $125,000 loan to Bradley's dental supply company wasn't a gift. It was a private loan with a signed agreement, one that included a due-on-demand clause my lawyer had insisted we include. Because 40 years in business teaches you to protect yourself, even when you love the person you're lending to. And the mortgage on the house in New Albany had my name on it as cosigner, which meant I had rights tied to that loan that Bradley clearly hadn't thought through when he decided I wasn't fit to stand in the same room as his family. I sat there with my coffee going cold, and I understood something plain and simple. These two people had built their entire new life on a foundation made out of my money, my credit, and my signature, and Bradley had just made it clear, in writing, that he considered me an embarrassment to be managed, rather than a father to be respected. So I decided, calm and complete, that if I wasn't fit to stand in that room, then none of what I'd built for them was fit to keep standing either. At 9 that morning, I called my lawyer, a steady, sharp woman named Renata Alvarez who had handled every contract for my shop for over 15 years. And I told her exactly what I wanted done. First, freeze the joint wedding account immediately, well within my rights as primary holder, since every dollar in it had come from my own transfers to begin with. Renata made one call to the bank, and within the hour, every pending payment to the venue, the caterer, and the florist was placed on hold pending my personal authorization I had no intention of ever giving. Second, invoke the due-on-demand clause on Bradley's business loan, meaning the full remaining balance was now legally due in full, effective immediately, a clause he'd signed without reading closely enough, because when a confident man gets handed free money, he rarely stops to read the fine print. Third, contact the mortgage lender about my position as cosigner and formally begin the process of removing myself from that loan entirely, a process that would trigger an immediate review of whether Bradley could carry that house on his income alone, since it never actually qualified without my name behind it. I wasn't trying to destroy my daughter's life. I was removing myself, completely and legally, from a financial structure I was no longer welcome to be part of as a human being. If Bradley didn't want me in the room, he didn't get to keep using my name to hold his entire world together while I waited outside like an inconvenience. By noon, every call had been made, every form signed, and the whole financial foundation under their wedding and their new life together had quietly come apart. The venue called Claire first. A woman from the events office explaining the account showed a hold and the balance hadn't cleared, and without full payment before the event, they couldn't guarantee the space. The caterer called next, then the florist, then the quartet. Each one polite but firm. No confirmed payment, no confirmed service. I know because the events coordinator actually called me directly first, out of professional courtesy, since my name was still listed on the account. I told her calmly the hold was intentional and there'd be no further authorization coming from me. Meanwhile, over at Bradley's brand new office, His business account got notified of the loan recall, and since his company was barely 5 months old with more expenses than revenue, there was no way for him to produce $125,000 in cash on short notice. He spent that whole Wednesday afternoon, from what I heard secondhand later, on the phone with 4 different banks trying to secure emergency financing, getting turned down by every one of them because a 5-month-old company with no real collateral doesn't qualify for that kind of rescue overnight. Somewhere in the middle of all that, the mortgage lender sent Claire and Bradley formal notice that their co-signer had begun withdrawal proceedings, meaning their monthly payment was about to get reassessed based on Bradley's income alone, an amount that, by the lender's own numbers, he could not currently afford by a wide margin. By 6 that evening, 4 days before their wedding, the entire life they'd built on my money had started coming apart at every seam at once, and neither one of them yet understood I was the reason why. 2 days later, on what should have been their wedding day, I sat at home at my own kitchen table, coffee in hand, at the same spot where I'd read that forwarded text 4 days earlier. I hadn't spoken to Claire since, and I hadn't reached out, because I wasn't the one who'd decided I shouldn't be there. Around 10 that morning, my neighbor Ruth, who knew one of the wedding vendors through her book club, mentioned over the fence that she'd heard the venue got quietly canceled the day before. Something about a payment problem, and that the caterer had backed out entirely. She had no idea the man trimming his hedges had personally frozen the whole event with 3 phone calls. By early afternoon, I heard from an old friend, still on the guest list, that people had shown up to a locked venue with a handwritten sign taped to the door, and that Bradley's mother, Linda, had been standing outside in her mother of the groom dress making frantic calls, trying to understand what had happened to an event that had been fully paid for weeks earlier. Claire, I learned later, spent that whole morning crying in her childhood bedroom down the hall from mine, because it turned out Bradley's family's lake property wasn't available as a backup either. There was no plan B, because Bradley and his family had assumed, the same way they'd assumed about everything, that the money would simply always be there, since it always had been before. What none of them understood yet was that the money had a name attached to it, and that name had finally decided he was done being invisible in his own daughter's life. I woke up the next morning at 5:30, same as always, and reached for my phone on the nightstand before I'd even opened my eyes. The screen was lit with notifications stacked so high the counter just read 99 plus. When I actually opened it, I counted 94 missed calls between the two of them, 31 from Bradley and 63 from Claire, along with a string of texts that started out angry and confused around midnight and slowly turned desperate and apologetic by 4 in the morning. Claire's messages went from, "Dad, what did you do?" to, "Dad, please, I don't understand what's happening," to finally, around 4:15, "Dad, I'm so sorry. Please call me. I never should have sent you that text without saying something. I love you, and I'm sorry." I sat on the edge of my bed and read every message slow, and I felt something complicated. Not joy exactly, but not sadness either. Something closer to a heavy, strange relief, the feeling of finally being seen clearly by the one person whose vision of me had gone blurry for a while. I made coffee, same as every morning, and let the phone sit quiet on the counter another hour while I drank it, because I've learned the calm has to come before the conversation, or the conversation goes nowhere worth having. Around 7, my phone rang one more time, Claire's name lighting up the screen, and I picked it up on the third ring, and her voice came through thin and shaking, nothing like the confident young woman who'd forwarded me that text 4 days before. "Dad," she said, and then she just cried for a long moment before she could get another word out. I let her cry for a bit before I spoke, and when I did, my voice came out steady, not cold, just clear. I told her I'd frozen the accounts, all of them, the wedding fund, Bradley's loan, my name on the mortgage, and that I'd done it the same morning I found out her fiancé didn't think I belonged at their wedding and she hadn't said a word in my defense. She apologized over and over, said Bradley never should have written that, said she'd made a horrible mistake forwarding it without saying anything herself, said she wanted to fix it. I told her the truth as gently as I knew how. I never needed a seat at that wedding to prove I was her father. I needed her to remember I already was one, every single day for 17 years, long before Bradley ever sat across from a dental supply catalog and decided my grease-stained hands made me less than his family. We talked almost 2 hours that morning, and I told her plainly what I needed going forward. Not money, not control, just honesty and respect. The same two things I'd given her every day since her mother passed. I told her the business loan would get restructured on fair terms, but only if Bradley sat across from me like a grown man and had an honest conversation. No more jokes about tradesmen over dinner. I told her I'd consider staying on that mortgage, but only if I was treated like her father again, not an inconvenient wallet standing outside the family photo. It took months. Real conversations, real humility from both of them, before things settled into something honest. Bradley, to his credit, eventually drove out to my shop on a Saturday afternoon, waited until my last customer left, and apologized like a man who finally understood exactly what he'd almost thrown away, both the money and the family that came with it. I walked my daughter down the aisle 7 months later at a small ceremony in my own backyard. Folding chairs from the shop, string lights hung between two oak trees. Just family, no performance, nobody pretending to be something they weren't. When she took my arm that afternoon, she looked at me and said the only thing that mattered anymore. This is the only wedding that was ever going to be real, Dad. And she was right. Claude responded, money can build a house, but it can never buy a seat at the table where you're actually respected. Money can build a house, but it can never buy a seat at the table where you're actually respected. What Walter really wanted wasn't control over his daughter's wedding. It was to matter to her, the same way he always had. Real love doesn't disappear when the accounts run dry. It shows up quietly, the same way it always did, waiting patiently to be seen again. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lesson stays with you a little while.